Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is Friday, January 24th, day 476 of the war. Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our senior analyst, Haviv Rettig Gur, for a schmoozy Friday focus. Thanks for joining me, Haviv, and where am I finding you today?
Hi, Amanda. I'm in a small town called New York City.
I've heard of it, yeah.
Where I've discovered there's quite a few Jews, and in fact, the Jews here invented the bagel. So,
Whoa, that
important
is
facts.
fake truth, but we'll let you have that one.
Wait, hold on. That is a fake truth?
Fake truth, fake.
The bagel was not invented in New York?
Fake news, I think. I mean, speaking as a former Canadian resident, obviously you can't beat the Montreal bagels, but we'll let you have a pass on this, Haviv.
Okay. And now we all have to go look it up. Okay.
Yeah. So, Haviv, tomorrow on Shabbat, another 4 hostages are set to be released from Gaza, and they're all presumably women, presumably alive, but as of this recording, we currently don't know who they are or what their status is. And alongside that, we currently don't know how many Palestinian security prisoners will also be released. In stage 1 of the deal, the current formula is 30 Palestinian prisoners for every civilian and 50 for every female soldier. We don't yet know the formula for male soldiers, which would be in the potential phase 2. So, Haviv, this is really complicated, a very emotional subject, and I want us to go back in time and talk about this painful issue of so-called exchanges between hostages and Palestinian prisoners. Haviv, obviously the most memorable exchange of prisoners came in 2011 when captured soldier Gilad Shalit was exchanged for 1,027 security prisoners. And as I remember it, Hamas forces entered Israel through a tunnel in 2006. It was actually on my brother's birthday, June 25th, and they forcibly took Shalit back into Gaza. So just for perspective, we're on day 476 of the war. Gilad Shalit was held for 1,934 days. Just mind-boggling. So, Haviv, what do you remember about his capture and the exchange that was made for his life?
Yeah, that's exactly right. The 25 June 2006 operation in which Hamas fighters crossed in a tunnel into Israel. By the way, I believe that's Hamas's very first tunnel operation from Gaza. Killed 2 Israeli soldiers, kidnapped Shalit. That launched what Israeli army called Operation Summer Rains, which was basically a 5-month military operation in Gaza to try and find him. There were something like 400 Gazans killed. I believe most of them Hamas, but obviously not all. It was kind of a very, very small microcosm of essentially what would happen after. And the reason that it in retrospect is a microcosm of what would happen over the last 16 months is that it was extraordinarily successful for Hamas. And what do I mean by that? Exactly what you said. On October 11, 2011, the Israeli government approves a deal reached through mediators, mainly the Egyptians. And in that deal, there are 1,027 people released from Israel's prison. They include 450 Hamas, literally people belonging to Hamas, and 280 of those were sitting in prison on life terms for terror attacks and murder, and in some cases mass murder. And they included, of course, Yahya Sinwar.
Before you start talking about who they included, and of course everyone knows it's Yahya Sinwar, I just want to go back and paint a little bit more a picture of the atmosphere in the country. I think people may forget because, of course, we're very, very preoccupied with what's happening now. But Gilad Shalit, his parents launched a massive campaign, and in many ways it was the blueprint for the Hostage Families Forum. They had marches on the capital. They went across the globe. Gilad Shalit is, I believe, also a French citizen, and they, included all the ambassadors, all sorts of world leaders. Everyone was included in this campaign that his parents spearheaded. And the whole country was behind them, of course, because in Israel, just to remind our listeners, pretty much, not everyone, but pretty much everyone's sons serve, most daughters as well. Most people in general here in the country have served in the military. So having a soldier be kidnapped from his post was a very traumatic event that happened, of course, Haviv, just a year, not even a year after the disengagement from Gaza.
Right. I think, what would that be? August to June. So we were out 10 months. And it really is Hamas's first strategic response. It would then, a year later in 2007, it would take over Gaza in a violent coup against the Palestinian Authority. But its first fundamental act was this kidnapping. And what's fascinating is that Hamas learned from the Shalit story. It learned from the kidnapping that the border is penetrable. It learned from watching Israeli society over the next 5 years. There was apparently in 2008 a draft deal to release but roughly half, something like 400 or 450 of those Hamas prisoners in exchange for Gilad Shalit. And the deal was then pushed off or was then rejected after it had been mostly hammered out, was then rejected by Israel. And there's a debate that's been going on in Israel ever since, in which Ehud Olmert, who was prime minister at the time, and defense minister Ehud Barak at the time, argue about who is responsible for that delay. And the argument essentially is that Ehud Barak made a big show of siding with the Shalit family, went to the Shalit family's protest tents in Jerusalem, and because he gave that sense of real political backing to the campaign, Ehud Olmert has claimed ever since, in public, in speeches, in op-eds, that Ehud Barak actually convinced Hamas that there was so much pressure on the government that it was worth waiting. In fact, it was probably the correct decision by Hamas on account of how 3 years later, an Netanyahu government, no longer an Olmert government, gives Hamas twice the number of prisoners for Gilad Shalit. And so everything is there. Everything is there. In terms of Hamas learning lessons, you take the kidnapped people, the hostages, you hold on to them, and you hold on to them for a long time, and you let Israeli society percolate. And then you get anything you want. You get huge, huge returns. And so the Shalit deal is Israelis talk about it that way. It's a big debate. Of course, it has to be said, none of this is Gilad Shalit's fault. None of it has to do with him. It's hard to be Gilad Shalit over the last 15 years. He was in a dungeon in Gaza when all of this happened, and all these decisions were made by all kinds of other people. He is one of the few people here who have no say in what actually happened over the course of this whole story. But in the Gilad Shalit story, Hamas learned that our Achilles heel is hostages, is kidnapping. And the purpose of October 7, strategic purpose, was this mass kidnapping so that we would reach the moment that we've reached now. And for Hamas, the fact that so much of Gaza is so devastated is a worthwhile price to pay for the enormous benefit, not even of getting out. There were at the beginning of the war something like 1,800 Palestinians in Israeli prisons. There are now something like 10,000. Huge numbers of Hamas fighters, huge numbers of various terror organizations in Gaza that have been captured in the course of battles. And so the release of 500, 1,000, they could release, 8,000 and still have a net loss in terms of the sheer number of Palestinians in an Israeli prison. But the point isn't even the release. And the point isn't victory. The point is tormenting the Israelis, because they have a long-term strategy that says that if the Israelis never have a day of rest, if they're tortured and tormented and beaten and abused constantly, then eventually, just like the French left Algeria and the British left Kenya, the Jews will leave the land of Palestine. That's the theory. And if that's the theory, the destruction of the Palestinian side is irrelevant. The torment has to continue. And the way you torment the Jews best is by taking hostages. That was the great Hamas strategic lesson, and it has become their grand strategy. And it's the heart of what happened in Gaza over the last 16 months. And Gilad Shalit is probably the tipping point in that.
We, the Holocaust survivors, are a rapidly diminishing group. We are in the last moments of being able to share with our young people our first-hand testimonies. Time is rapidly running out. Each year sees smaller numbers of survivors able to accompany students on the March of the Living. Marching with students and survivors from many countries in those terrible places allows our students to learn and understand through stories and eyewitness accounts about our resilience, our strength, and our determination.
This Yom HaShoah, the Jewish Holocaust Remembrance Day, many survivors like Ava want to march at the International March of the Living in Auschwitz. They need your help. To sponsor a survivor on the March of the Living, go to motl.org.
You are reminding me, of course, of the famous Joe Biden story in which Golda Meir obviously said, the only thing that we have on our side, we Jews, is that we have nowhere else to go. And obviously that's what makes us different from the French in Algeria, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, Haviv, I cut you off when we were talking about who got out during the Gilad Shalit deal. And everyone knows about Sinwar. We've heard countless stories about Sinwar, and it's an open wound, definitely. But Sinwar was only one of the 1,027, I think it was. So out of the 1,026 others, there were some really big baddies, of course. And there's one in particular that stands out to you. So who is he?
This is not the biggest murderer. Nasser Yataima was serving 29 life sentences for his part in the Park Hotel bombing in 2002 that launched Operation Defensive Shield. In the framework of the Second Intifada, a suicide bomber walks into a ballroom of a hotel on the beaches of Netanya and blows up his belt in a ballroom of I don't know, a couple hundred people celebrating the Passover Seder together, and he kills 30 people, among them, most of them elderly. And there's people there serving 15 life sentences and 9 life sentences. Mazen Fuka was he launched a suicide bombing in 2002 as well that killed 9 people. Just a long, long list of genuinely just horrific mass murderers. But there was one particular individual released in the Shalit deal that speaks to the long arc of this historic lesson of the development of the hostage strategy against Israel, and therefore of the need for Israel to have a very, very profound rethinking after October 7. And that is a gentleman by the name of Zakaria Najib. Zakaria Najib commanded the kidnapping on October 9th, 1994, of an Israeli soldier named Nachshon Waxman. This was a very well carried out kidnapping. He was taken to a place called Bir Nabala, north of Jerusalem, and he was held there for 6 days. A tape of him was released to the Israeli public, and it was also released from multiple places in Gaza, not just around Jerusalem. And that forced Israeli intelligence to try and trace down the tape in all kinds of places that were irrelevant. So they had very thought-out sort of counterintelligence measures. They demanded the release of Hamas's founder and spiritual leader, Ahmed Yassin, and 200 other prisoners. And the Israeli Seyeret Matkal unit was tasked with his rescue once he was located on October 14. And that rescue went very badly. Nachshon Waxman himself was murdered by his captors during the rescue, and one of the soldiers also was killed. That experience inside the army launched a whole new process an entire office in the army began to develop doctrine of essentially hostage rescue, how you burst into a place very quickly, take down the bad guys in a way that doesn't give them time to pull the trigger on the hostage, right? It's a whole capability. The unit formed out of that new office is today the very, very elite combat engineering unit called Yahalom, which has done a preponderance of the work in Gaza's tunnels, and is
Syria, in other places that we probably can't discuss yet.
Right. When you need to blow up a Hezbollah installation to the point where it is registered as an earthquake back in Israeli territory, that's Yahalom. And so Yahalom is this very, very big and dramatic and significant new military capability born in the experience of these absolutely elite Sayeret Matkal soldiers who just didn't know how to do that. And that is a special capability. And so now we have all these new capabilities born out of this hostage-taking experience. But the story with Zakaria Najib is that he was caught by Israelis, by the Israeli security forces, and he was imprisoned, and he was released in the Shalit deal.
And I just want to add, before you continue with that, everyone knows Gilad Shalit. I mean, everyone knows who he is. Everyone knows the name. But Nachshon Wachsman was the Gilad Shalit of his generation. And if you ask any Israeli about him, he's so clearly remembered, and this case is so clearly remembered. So continue, Haviv.
Right. It cuts to the quick. It is. And by the way, understanding that is really understanding the trauma for Israelis of October 7th, because the trauma wasn't just the dead. We've had wars and we've had waves of terrorism with larger death tolls, actually, than October 7th. It's up there, but it's not, but we've experienced the death toll itself. It was the sense that we failed them. It was the sense that hour after hour on October 7th, we were watching their literally WhatsApps. I mean, we both know fellow journalist colleagues who are sitting there with their kids in a safe room, watching Hamas guys walking outside in their villages. That sense of helplessness, while someone took our people, is a violation of everything we are, and feels to us like a betrayal of the victims. And that was absolutely, when Wachsman was taken, that was at the top of the mind of all, or just about all, Israelis. And the same was true in 2006 with Gilad Shalit. The thing is that Zakaria Najib reappears among the Hamas forces in Shifa Hospital in late March. When the IDF went in for a 2-week battle into Shifa Hospital, killed a great many Hamas fighters, including Najib, and took quite a few prisoner. He was in the fighting forces, and he was a commander in the fighting forces of Hamas years and years and years later, after the Shalit deal, right? 14 years later. So this arrestee who had planned one hostage taking, one kidnapping, is then released in the deal for another kidnapping, and is then in the fighting forces of Hamas facing the IDF after a third kidnapping. Kidnapping is this thread that runs through Hamas's fundamental strategy. And once you've taught your enemy that this is your great weakness, and your enemy organized its entire warfighting concept around that weakness, it's time to have a serious conversation about how to change that fundamental calculation within Israeli society and for the enemy.
Right. And you said that the primary goal is not the prisoner release, but it sure is a side effect of all of this. And that too, as you said, we have Yahya Sinwar, we have Najib, we have all sorts of terrible people who have gotten out and caused more damage and havoc to Israelis, the Jewish people at large even. And right now, there are a lot of families who are re-traumatized from the sheer fact that the killers of their family members are on these lists again. I'm just one person, Haviv, and I know my old study partner was murdered at Mount Scopus during a bombing, and his friend. I knew both of those people. I know our neighbor, a good neighbor, his brother was killed in a terrorist shooting in Otniel. Another neighbor, her brother-in-law was stabbed to death. And all of these killers are going to be let free if the hostage release deal continues. It's so many people. And I am one person, and I already know so many people. It's a huge gaping wound.
Look, in 2014, in June 2014, a Hamas cell kidnapped 3 Israeli teens and killed them. And during the search for them, essentially, that was the beginning, because of Hamas rocket fire, that was the beginning of the 2014 Gaza war. Well, that was an initiative, that operation to kidnap them, of Mahmoud Kawasma, who was a Hamas member released in the Shalit deal. There was a police officer, a senior police officer, Baruch Mizrahi, killed in 2014, April 2014, by a guy named Ziad Awad, who was released in the Shalit deal, and was then recaught. And it's just story after story after story. Ahmed Najjar was the head of a Hamas cell that killed Malachi Rosenfeld in 2015 in a shooting. So when you release 1,027, including 280 serving life sentences, and many of them serving multiple life sentences, and you release them in order to get one Israeli back, the sheer simple math, okay? This is, never mind the moral conclusions or the political conclusions or the strategic conclusions. The simple math is you have just condemned to death who knows how many other Israelis. And we're talking about quite a few. The examples are a long list, and they're all available online, folks. It's not a hard search. And so, there's a fundamental question here. We have to get out our people. We have to change the fundamental equation. If, because the Trump administration decided that it no longer approves of war, and therefore Hamas can retake Gaza and will simply be there forevermore, and won its survival from this war by the fact that it has hostages, every enemy we have on every border we have will look to kidnap more Israelis. And so there has to come a point where we find a way. We've raised the cost to the other side of taking Israeli hostages, but the other side doesn't feel those costs. Hamas doesn't feel the costs of Gaza's destruction, of the level of destruction that was inflicted on Gaza by the fact that the Israeli army had to literally get through the cities to get into tunnels and go searching for them. We have to lower their value to the enemy. And maybe the way to do that, I'm saying something radical and awful and anti-Israeli. Maybe the way to do that is to lower their value to us. And I don't know if that's a good thing to say. I don't know if that's the way forward. Certainly don't know if there's a political ability to do that among Israeli leadership. But that's the conundrum that our enemies have imposed on us. And sometimes the enemy gets to set the battlefield and the terms of the war.
Of course, the formula today is a lot different than the Gilad Shalit deal. As I said at the top of the program, it's 30 prisoners per civilian, 50 per soldier, female soldier. We don't know about the male soldiers yet. So that in itself, we've lowered the cost, right? That has happened. But, and this is going to sound terrible as well, as the mother of 3 combat soldiers, 3 of my children have entered the IDF in combat roles since October 7th, since the terrible disaster. When they enter the IDF, they take a vow to serve and even forfeit their lives if needed. That's a different thing than civilians, right? The soldiers who were kidnapped are in a different situation, just essentially different. The essence of their being right then was a soldier versus the civilians. And it's terrible. And as a parent, I would go crazy and do everything I could to get my children out. But as a society, I wonder, Haviv, should it be that soldiers cost more than civilians?
It doesn't, I don't know. I mean, in theory, sure. I personally, when it comes to sort of the moral language of this conflict, I think that when they attack civilians, it's terrorism, and when they attack soldiers, it's not terrorism, it's war. You have, beef with the state of Israel and you attack its soldiers, even if it's a surprise attack, that's just a tactic. It's far more legitimate. But it sure as heck doesn't feel that way. And so I understand logically the extension of that to the question of kidnapping. But it sure doesn't feel that way. You take our people, we are going to be torn apart, and in our pain and grief, we will come for you, and we will come for you with just devastating determination. And Hamas's response to our determination was a determination that translated into a willingness to just let us turn Gaza upside down. And we found what we found, which is very few, because it's not actually that, Gaza, they keep talking about it being very small. It's small in the sense that New York City is small, right? It's immense. It's just on a big world map, tiny, but you can lose somebody there forever and ever, right? As we learned from Gilad Shalit, the operation to rescue him was 5 months, and he wasn't moved constantly the way these hostages are being moved constantly. But the basic story, is functionally, in other words, irrespective of this sort of rational, moral, calculations, to the Israeli public, it feels the same. And so politically, it has the same effect on Israel. And so, no, we have to change the equation. And part of changing the equation is exacting overpowering, horrific costs. And one of my frustrations with this government is that those costs were not exacted across the board. In other words, Hamas has supporters, allies, backers, funders. They paid no cost. How is it possible that the Qataris at the beginning of this war told the Israelis, don't assassinate any Hamasnik in Qatar? And not a single Hamasnik was assassinated in Qatar. How could that be possible? How could any Hamasnik be allowed to live in Turkey? Because Turkey threatens? If you have Hamas, and Hamas kidnaps hundreds of our people, those Hamasnikim are going to die everywhere and anywhere. And it's on you to not have things blow up in Istanbul, not on us. They host Hamas openly, publicly. So, I think that we did not conduct, we were very, very hesitant in terms of policy. This is something that, I and many others, but people like me, were saying on the question of Hezbollah and Iran many, many months ago. And then when Israel actually got to work, actually pushing back on Iran and its proxies, it turned out that it wasn't this catastrophically dangerous thing. And the fear of opening those fronts was Israeli hesitancy and not, in fact, some kind of a strategic, carefulness and professionalism and seriousness. We face the similar problem now. The Houthis have just announced that because there's a ceasefire, they're no longer going to shoot at all shipping through the Suez Canal, which has hurt the Egyptians much more than it's hurt the Israelis. They're only going to shoot at Israel-bound or Israel-registered ships.
Or linked in any way.
Or linked in any way. And that's something you can find on a website, so it's not hard to distinguish them, but that's the Houthi decision. The Houthis are trying to climb down a little bit off the tree because the Israelis have destroyed their capacity to ship natural gas and oil almost entirely out of their territory and cost them their main source of foreign currency, and their own currency is not usable in the international markets. So we've caused them vast harm, but they're still going to shoot. Why are they still going to shoot? These are people who don't care that 85,000 children starved to death, 6 years ago in a war that they started. And so these are not people who are deterrable by the need to develop and prevent the suffering of and increase the well-being of their own people. So here's the thing. The Houthis are an unbelievably incompetent, barbaric, profoundly backward, basically desert tribe. They do not have ballistic missiles that they make. Every ballistic missile they launch at us was made by somebody else. And that somebody else is Iran. So questions that people like me ask is, why when an Iranian ballistic missile is shot from Yemen at us, is there not an Israeli response as if it was an Iranian ballistic missile shot from Iran? How do you increase? So there is an Israeli capacity to cut out from Hamas its backup, its support system. In fact, they're very fragile. They're much more fragile than Hamas itself for the simple reason that they don't want to fall in a way that Hamas is perfectly willing to have all of Gaza collapse. It took us months and months and months of bowing to Biden's pressure to go into Philadelphia. And through all those months, Hamas was resupplying as quickly as we were destroying their material. So again, we have to have a new policy, and that new policy has to have two aspects. And I welcome conversation about this. I welcome angry emails about this. But if you're going to send angry emails, make them tortured emails, okay? Really, truly feel the powerful pain of all the different sides. By the way, it wasn't just Sinwar, who is a Shalit releasee, who planned October 7. One of the commanders of the Nukhba force in central Jabalia was a guy named Ali Qadi, released in the Shalit deal, and one of the major commanders of one of Hamas's elite forces in one of its major fortresses, essentially, in Gaza throughout this war, who was killed, right at the beginning, back in mid-October. Long story short, we need a two-pronged policy. One, any support for Hamas by anyone, anywhere, will face massive Israeli retaliation. Hamas is not a thing that can exist anymore. In terms of Iranian support, Turkish support, Qatari support, we have red lines, and those are our red lines. And by the way, when we started acting on red lines, the Iranians backed off. Everybody backed off. Everybody got scared. Everybody started rethinking their strategic calculations. And two, we have to lower their value. The next kidnapping, to prevent the next kidnapping, we have to exact accountability from the Israeli leadership. Right now, just about everybody who was in charge on October 7 is gone, except one guy, and he's not leaving, and he's convinced he's the only reason Israel survived this moment. People like me are convinced Israel's incredibly strong, and he actually held us back at multiple stages this moment. So we have to exact accountability from our leadership to make sure that they understand that you have to prevent that kind of kidnapping. Don't take your eyes off the ball of any enemy that claims that it wants to do this anymore. And two, you have to exact massive costs that they're going to feel, not just to them, but to all of their allies and support system. And three, you got to stop negotiating and giving away massive numbers of prisoners and mass murderers for hostages. The next batch of hostages in the next war in 10 years, shouldn't be coming out.
Oh, so easy to say until it's your child in there, Haviv, and I so understand where you're coming from, but it's so
And I'm not
tormenting.
the guy who's going to make that decision, right? I'm just a commentator years away.
Right. Exactly. I have no envy for any of the leadership that we have right now, or any future leadership, really. It's such a tormenting, painful, terrible decision to have to make. But I think, as you said, it's so sadly a necessary one, because we have to end this cycle. It's just terrible. Haviv, thank you for joining me from the bagel capital of the world. Did I say that? And I hope to see you soon. We got a
Canadian acknowledgement, official Canadian acknowledgement of that. You're welcome, New York.
And I can't wait to see you back home in Israel.
Thanks, Amanda.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Please check out another installment tomorrow. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until tomorrow, shalom.